Hello, so today we're going to be going over the derivative of an inverse function. Here, let me just write that down really quickly. So, to find the derivative of an inverse function, we first need to know two things. The first thing that we need to know is how to find the inverse function. And if we don't know how to find the inverse function, then there is a simple formula, which is the second thing that we need to learn. So let's start with a basic example of finding like the inverse function of a very basic function. So y equals x plus 1. So the method to finding the inverse function is you replace all x's with y's and all y's with x, right? And then you use SADMAP to move it so then there's only one y term on one side. And SADMAP is just the opposite of PEMDAS, which is just the order of operations, right? So in this case, you go x equals y plus 1, and then you go x minus 1 equals y, and that's the inverse function of this. So now, let's try a bit harder function. Let's go f of x equals x plus 1 over x plus 3, right? So this is the same as y equals x plus 1 over x plus 3, right? And now, using our rules, we get, of finding the inverse function, we get x equals y plus 1 over y plus 3. And now we need to make it so then there's one y on one side and there's x's on the other, right? So we multiply this by that, right? You cross multiply, and that would be your first step. So then you would get x, y, plus 3x, that's a comma, in case you couldn't tell, equals y plus 1. So there's a 1 on this side, and there's a 3x and a y, right? So we should move the y onto that side, and then the 3x onto this side, right? So now you get x, y, minus y equals 1 minus 3x. So now moving down, we can factor a y out of this, and then you would get y times x minus 1 equals 1 minus 3x. And then to get y by itself, you would get 1 minus 3x over x minus 1, right? So then you divide both sides by x minus 1, and then x minus 1, right? So then the inverse of x equals this right here, 1 minus 3x over x minus 1, right? So now that we know how to find the inverse function, you should know how to take the derivative of this function if given this, right? But there's some functions where you can't take the inverse of, right? A common example of something that we can't take the inverse of is something like, here, let's go f of x equals x cubed plus 3x squared minus 2x plus 4. Like, I don't know how you would find the inverse of that function, right? But if given a function where you can't find the inverse of, the way that you would take the derivative of an inverse function here is f inverse prime of x equals 1 over f prime of f inverse of x, right? So this is just like a weird way of saying it's the reciprocal of the inverse of like the value, okay, of f inverse of x put into f prime of x. And this makes sense because f prime of x times f inverse prime of y, I guess, has to equal 1, right? Because that's just like how inverses work. So here, we can do this, right? So it'd be like, find the derivative of f of x at point, this is a 4 by the way, at point, let's say 6, right? So find f inverse prime of 6. So this is saying that the y value of f of x is equal to 6, right? So this is the same as saying, okay, I'm gonna need to erase this. I'll rewrite this up here, that way you can still see it, right? So f inverse prime of x equals 1 over f prime of f inverse of x, right? So that's over there. So this is the same thing as saying, so we need to evaluate what f prime of f inverse of 6 is, right? Because that's this part, right? So this is the same as saying 6 equals x cubed plus 3x squared minus 2x plus 4, right? And if you just plug in and check, you would get 1, right? So x equals 1 is the answer to this. Yeah, you could probably do something like factor and stuff, because this is the same as x plus 1. Now that's way too complicated. Regardless, you get x equals 1 if you just plug in, right? So f inverse prime, so now we need to write it down. So then f inverse of 6 equals 1, right? So now we know this part. Now we just need to find f prime of x, right? So f prime of x equals 3x squared plus 6x minus 2, right? So now you just get 1 over f prime of 1, which equals 1 over 3 times 1 squared plus 6 times 1 minus 2, which equals 1 over 3 plus 6 minus 2, which equals 1 over 7, right? And then that would be your answer. And that is a very basic solving the derivative of an inverse.